So, one of the subjects, obviously, medicine is very important in the at-home aspect of technology these days. And one thing that I ran across a couple of years ago, and I've been interested in since then, is the question of if you have medical devices embedded in your body, who owns the data that's being generated by those medical devices? Just to give you an example, there are several possible models for that data. So those medical devices attached to your heart or your other organs could be generating some sort of signal which is sent back to a central point, stored at that central point, and then processed, and certain things happen with that data. Alternatively, the data could be stored locally and could be downloaded at a certain point. But in any case, these devices will be knowing things about you and your body. They could know what's happening in your blood chemistry. They could know what's happening through your daily cycle. They could know a whole lot of things. If you had one device from one company and another device from another company, are those two devices going to talk to each other? So together they might know something which is extremely important for you and which could save your life. But just on the face of it, if you think about the problems that have occurred in standardising health informatics in Australia over, say, the last 15 or 20 years, where basically decade after decade we go nowhere. I hope there are no medical informatics people who feel we're making a lot of progress here that I've just offended, but the impression I get is that pilot after pilot we go nowhere, usually because the government's trying to use these pilots as a method of changing the relationship within the whole medical structure, and that becomes complicated and everything becomes complicated. But in 15 or 20 years' time, this data is going to be there, and how do we make sure that we control the data for our benefit? I'll just leave it there.
So in terms of open source biotech and at home, let me paint a picture where in maybe 15 years' time, your home will be powered by microbes that sit in a tank. They absorb light from the sun. As they absorb that light, they've got hydrogenase enzymes that turn the light into hydrogen, which is hooked up to a hydrogen tank, which you connect up to your car, and you also use to store energy so that at night time you still have electricity being generated from a fuel cell. It's all being done without any carbon emissions. That's a possible future with open source biotech. At home.
Well, for me, the concept of being at home with technology is really just about maintaining a sense of curiosity about things. I'm probably coming from a fairly different position to many of the people in the room here, but I suppose I look at the world as if I was a child and try to maintain that sort of curiosity, try to figure out how things work, and not have preconceived ideas about things. And this really comes down to what I was covering in my talk about not simply taking something at face value and saying that is the way it was manufactured, or this is my environment, so that's the way it always has to be. But always to be thinking about how can I adjust this to suit my own needs, or how can I tune this, or remake it.
I've got, I guess, two perspectives I'd like to share. I was the R&D tech lead for an 8-year project for automating a home, and it was a pretty interesting experience in seeing what it was like practically to do this. The cost, the issues with things failing, security and privacy, because the owner was living in this home, and had to worry about a team of people who I guess could intimately know about someone else's life, just through supporting the technology. So that was a pretty interesting adventure. The other one is I have a teenage daughter, and she's grown up in a house just jam-packed with technology, and every week for the last 2 to 3 years, a bunch of hackers come around in the garage, and they play with 3D printers and CNC milling machines and rockets, and in a few months' time probably be building an open PCR machine to do some biology hacking. And it's been really interesting to see her grow up in this, and a sort of fairly laissez-faire attitude to all this stuff. So she just will happily just swan from machine to machine, looking things up, playing games, interacting, but she's not hugely into Facebook or social networking, much rather go out and sort of kick a ball around or visit with friends. And so it's becoming interleaved in her life, but in a way that just doesn't really bother too much. Whereas for me, this is would have been my dream as a kid to grow up with all this stuff, and it's like, yeah, so what? So it's interesting to observe.
On the medical business, it's never yours. I had a GP for several years. He retired or moved into another area. I asked for the records and I was sent a bill. This was in Melbourne. I was sent a bill from a place in Sydney saying, we have patent right over your medical records. Send us $8 and we will forward them to wherever you want. So I thought, no, if the GP had said, pay me $20 and I'll photocopy them for you, I said, fine, you know, but when I get this organisation I've never heard of before saying they have a copyright, actually, over my medical records without my ever knowing about it. Not happy. So I don't think you're ever going to get the rights to your medical records.
Unless you collect it yourself.
Yeah.
Well, something that's happened recently a few times is people have just basically taken their DNA records and put them up into GitHub as an open source code repository and basically published it for the whole world and said, look, there it is. So basically it's in the public domain now. Or kind of. It's not public domain, but it's certainly not, their DNA is no longer owned by a company.
The scenario that I painted was one where you could actually suffer a personal injury. Obviously, in your case, if you don't know your medical history, that can be a disadvantage. But in a situation where these two devices are simply not talking, or you decide to travel and the people and the country that you travel to doesn't have an appropriate relationship with a provider, it's okay to carry a GPS or a mobile phone somewhere and have it operate in a weird way because of some different regulatory environment. But if it's stuff implanted in your body, the potential is a whole lot more. It's a whole lot more important that we do control those things. I take your point. It may be a hard fight, but I think at some stage in the future, if we're talking about humanity plus, if we're talking about actually going somewhere further in the future, that's going to be an important battle.
Actually, a practical example of this sort of scenario. There is a gentleman who came along to LinuxConf in Brisbane earlier this year and took part in a hardware assembly session where he assembled a board which is actually the same as this board here, which was designed originally as a data logging system for high altitude balloon projects and rockets. In fact, this was on the balloon that went up with that tux photo you saw earlier. Anyway, the point of this is that he went back to the US and he has a sleep problem. He has sleep apnea and some other issues. And so he physically attached this, which has an accelerometer and various other sensors, to his body and is logging his own data while he sleeps. So he has now published a whole lot of information about his own physiological responses to things. So he has gone out, built the technology, and is collecting the data himself.
Okay, the floor's open to questions.
Are there any sociologists in the audience? Like
Are there any sociologists in the room?
Is there a general? I call them peakers. You know, the average people in the peak of the bell curve. We're not normal. Right? We're freaks. But the peakers, how are they reacting in general towards technology? Are they feeling threatened? I mean, does anyone here can answer the question? Is there a general anti-technology, anti-science movement growing, or is it weakening? Or
are you asking if there's any Luddites in the room?
Or we haven't got iPhones. Also,
no
I
sociologists?
find people avoid it because they're afraid they don't understand it. People I work with will say, oh, you know, I'm not computer literate, or I'm not. Because they're afraid they won't understand it.
I think Andy's comment about his daughter here is very relevant. I mean, the younger generation that's growing up with it is having no trouble growing up with it.
It's just part of their environment. I think that technology is so pervasive now that it's not possible. It's only a small percentage of people on the planet who aren't affected by it. I think there's now about 2 billion people on the internet, so that's 2/7 of humanity. And I think things like people wearing glasses, that's a form of technology. We're just surrounded by it. Clothing manufacture. So I don't think people can basically get away from technology now. It's simply about of which technology do you choose to use and which ones don't you choose to use.
they believe it when they see it in general.
Yeah.
They whinge more about the social aspects of the internet more than new technologies. Well, just ignore it until it happens on the street, and then they talk about it.
I think there is some fear in the community, especially a current example is mobile phones, with the recent research that's showing that there might be some risks with mobile phone exposure, and wireless networks as well. I've met quite a few people who are choosing to isolate themselves from technology for that reason, and they almost feel like technology is being imposed upon them from the rest of society, that they've got wireless networks broadcasting data at them all the time, GSM towers in their local area. I don't know how prevalent this attitude is, whether it's a big thing or whether it's just a few people who are afraid.
This is more an issue for the owners of the technology rather than the technology itself.
Yeah.
You know, there's no doubt there is, even amongst the younger generation, an undercurrent of conspiracy theorists to see everything through those eyes. I don't know how you break that. I know quite intelligent conspiracy theorists who can't break it's just like an addiction to heroin or something like that.
I'll throw in there, one of the biggest things that I found in my research with, talking to people how they go about using technology is depending on its purpose and how pervasive the message is about it. Like you gave an example just before about some company gave you a call up and found out that through whatever they were doing, they own the copyright to your medical records. But outside of that, if, like you said, if the GP had just openly disclosed what it was to you, then you would have been more open to what that was. And that's how people's view tends to be approached from that general mass, from when technology is presented. We do live in a world where we are the most monitored population in this time. Places like Sydney have over, just Sydney in the hub has something like 6,000 CCTVs sitting there going somewhere that we don't even know. And then there's the laws that control that. So it's back to what we were talking about before with who owns the data and who has access to it. And where's like the open data movement, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I think it is. They're really standing for, this is open. You're recording me somewhere. Just because you're recording me doesn't mean you own it.
It begs the question of ownership. I hear Monsanto is apparently starting to patent biological species. I mean, this is absurd. This is absolutely outrageous that these corporations can just say, okay, we're going to claim that just because we figured it out, we're going to say it's our invention. It's nature. It's not their bloody invention. The point is, it's about ownership. That this has to go. This is an old idea from an old version of man. We're in the 21st century now. Technology is our religion, not religion.
Yeah, well, certainly it appeared that it's a use of technology, it's the issue perhaps rather than the technology itself. And this panel was around home technology in the home. So one issue that concerns me is that for a number of types of business, particularly those who produce or just actually distribute content, the only way for them to safeguard their content is for them to effectively own the machinery in your home, so your entertainment systems and so on. If they don't have absolute control over those systems in your home, then they aren't able to maintain control of the content that they wish to sell everyone. So so all forms of data where someone has a vested interest, commercial interest in controlling that data. So it could be smart meters for your billing, or your entertainment systems, or control of devices to use electricity so they can shut things down to preserve the grid. It's going to be who actually owns the parts of the environment you live in your home.
Another issue, might be going a little bit off tangent here, is leakage of information inadvertently as well. So we're talking about information being tied up and proprietarised, really. This was driven home to me fairly recently when my company was doing a project for energy monitoring, and we put in place little home-built energy monitoring devices in the houses of, I think, about 7 of our staff, and they were tracking power consumption across all the different circuits in the house. And we pulled that information back to a central monitoring system which was logging it and generating graphs of power consumption, just for visualization purposes. And one day I was in a meeting with one of my staff and a client, I think it was, and we pulled up the graph on the screen showing the power consumption in the house of this particular staff member. This would have been about 9:30 in the morning. And he said, oh look, my wife's just got home from the school run. I can tell because the power's just gone up by 2.4 kilowatts, so she's turned on the kettle. and so this was an unexpected side effect, the fact that this was information leakage from something that we weren't monitoring whether she was in the house, we were monitoring power consumption. And that sort of thing is going to become much more prevalent as we are monitoring more and more elements of our lives.
I think that sort of raises the question of Big Brother. That was raised 8 years ago on being observed by the government through various. At the time it was feedback from the televisions, which obviously is ridiculous. But like you're saying now, with just sensors in the power grid, access to webcams and all sorts of other things, we could be spied on even in the privacy of our homes 24/7 and not even know about it. And technology could raise a big problem there.
Yeah.
I think an attitude that people my age especially have is we know we're being monitored, we know nothing is private anymore, but we don't really care. There's so much information out there that...
You don't care yet, but the side effects will come and bite you.
It has to be about freedom of information. Concentration of information in the hands of corporations that are looking at a profit motive is not going to be conducive to a happy, well-adjusted society, is it?
You've got lip reading of CCTV now, and Google's got 2,500 pieces of information on what you've been looking at on the internet for the last 8 or 10 years. They sell to people for money.
I guess it's a question of trust. Do I trust Google?
No, you can't trust.
I think it's also interesting. I mean, we're talking about Big Brother here, but a lot of us have got cameras, and in the future, the technology is going to become adequate enough for us to be carrying around equipment to life. Cast or record what's going on. That doesn't just mean visual situations, that means quantifying the self and maybe even sharing that information with people who you trust. And maybe we'll have some form of social network embedded over all this information. Now, this is not Big Brother only looking down from above, this is grassroots, little brother and sister. Germaeus Cassio actually coined the term the participatory panopticon. Have you heard of that? It's look it up. It's really interesting. It's the philosophy. It's not really a philosophy. It's based on the idea of panopticon, an old-style jail where everybody could, all the prisoners could be seen at any particular time, but they did not know they could be seen. And I think the interesting point is that all of us might be walking around, and we may be recorded from so many angles. You will create forms of transparency, and because there's so many angles being recorded, it'll become very hard to lie. Okay? So in a sense, I mean, it'll be some form of forced transparency, and privacy may become hard after that. Anyway, that's just a comment. But I'd like to hear your comments on what I just...
Well, I think what's happening is this is not a new problem for decades now. Anyone with a credit card, there's obviously organisations out there that know a lot more about you than you do, just through your purchasing patterns. But what's happening now is it's becoming more pervasive, into our homes, our vehicles. It's only a matter of time before insurance companies will adjust your premiums based on actual driving data. I hope we get through that limbo stage to where we get to the point where vehicles just drive us around and it's all done and dusted, because the next couple of decades aren't going to be much fun in that regard. But as you point out, it's going to be not this little brother and sister thing. It's where people can see what each other are doing through Facebook, where the leakage of information is there. Is where you friend someone. What you're inadvertently doing is all the information is becoming available to a broader network of people. I just thought just between you and I, but no, it's between you and I and your friends. And then if they actually do something to an advertiser, all privacy's gone. So I think that's the thing we're not contending yet with is it's gone. It's becoming ubiquitous.
Yeah, just a word of warning there. Don't allow yourself to get tagged in photos on Facebook. Go to the security settings, and on the bottom left, make a specific request to untag. Facebook will keep this, and Google will keep this, and so you have permanent record of all sorts of.
Just a point of order. We've got people been putting up their hand, and we want to allow some sort of chain of people talking. So.
I just want to ask, why do you think public policy and especially law, there's always a kind of delay with technological development and then the development of public policy and law to protect privacy or an individual's rights? I'm just interested in why you think that happens. Why is there the delay?
I don't think it can be any other way. We can't project what technology is going to do, so there's no way to pass laws in anticipation of it. It really is a matter of development of technology having an impact on society, and it takes a while for us to see what that impact is. And it's not necessarily obvious whether it's good, bad, indifferent, or context specific.
There is some interesting work being done by the Cyberspace Law and Policy Centre based at the University of New South Wales, which has taken this question up from the point of view of, do we need to change the law every time technology changes? And there's actually a fairly strong argument that says we don't. What we need to do is to understand the implication of new technology in relation to existing laws and principles. We don't need to, if we set ourselves a goal of chasing technology change with our laws, we will always fail.
Yeah.
I can give you the details on that.
Yeah, in an ideal world, the law is meant to reflect community standards and what we think is acceptable or unacceptable, and that's an experiment with the app. I guess we have to understand first before we can make laws. What bothers me more is when the law is manipulated by vested interests to perhaps preserve a status quo that is no longer relevant.
Patent law is a case in point.
Obviously, technology, we're changing ourselves and our society at an increasing rate, and we have to allow change. And if we allow powerful, old school thinking to prevent important change, I think that's a danger.
Yeah. I'd just like to make a bet with the members on the panel that you're almost certainly going to be in the same position as me. You've got social media, you've got all of the sort of stuff we've just been discussing that we feel compelled to participate in. You're not really with it if you're not there. I bet you're like me, you don't actually spend huge amounts of time on Facebook or any of these other things because you're busy doing other things. You're actually creating, like one of the things, I write science fiction in my spare time, such as it is, and one of the things I find people, fans will write in and say, look, I Googled that and I didn't find it. Well, of course, I read a bleeding book in the State Library. I went through the newspapers for 1901 and read 6 months worth of 1901 newspapers to get some background on, a couple of my recent books, adult books about the bombing of Australia's first parliament, which time travel was prevent, that sort of stuff. But the point is, there's a lot of material out there that actually isn't part of the electronic sort of general sphere. And number one, and number two, just feeling compelled to participate in it is a huge time sink that we don't really need to be part of. Why do you need to know that somebody's just arrived at the airport and has had a cup of coffee? I mean, I don't, but this is the sort of stuff that you actually see streaming past all the time. Does anybody out there on the panel spend a huge amount of time on Facebook? Or are they like me, have quiet time to do real work?
Yeah, I use social media quite a lot, and I agree that it can be a time sink if it's not used effectively, but I treat it as something that can be used as an investment. It's one-to-many communication. It's like me sitting up here. You're all learning something about me a lot more than if I spoke to you one-on-one. Twitter and Facebook can be the same thing if you're providing value rather than just providing trivia about you having a coffee at the airport. And I think that's what Twitter has been really effective at. The people who stay with Twitter are not the ones who post meaningless status updates. They're the ones who are pointing out valuable information, passing on their opinions in a really succinct way. and they can create a connection with their readership.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that just quickly. During the recent Queensland floods, we actually lost a lot of data centres. Like, river height data centres don't work real well over 60 feet of water. The solar cells don't get the power. Thing is, people put it in and actually said what the river heights were doing, whether it's raining, what sort of damage was going on, when our sensors got knocked out. So social media has extremely good applications, but the peer pressure is to just use them for the way everybody else is using them. I think you have to continually turn them off, sit back and say, what's a really good application for Twitter? Well, it's to supplement when other infrastructure things go down, not to just continually bomb your life out to everybody.
I think there's a time and place for it, especially if you're doing something that requires focus. If you need to lock yourself away and do a lot of research, then maybe that's a good use of your time. But the other aspect of it is that if you wanted to know about the 1901 bombings of the Parliament, what you could do is you could go onto Twitter, and here's an example, and say, who here knows a lot about the 1901 bombings? Can I go and can I have a coffee with you? So you could shortcut your research by getting in touch with people who already know a lot.
But they might write my book first. One of the things interests me about, I guess this point in general, is I think young people, one of the advantages of not being immortal and all that is young people adapt a lot easier to new technology than older people have a tendency to in our society. I'm interested to hear people's opinion on how we can, if we're going to extend people's lives, how we can make that less the case going forward. So make it so that people do continue to adapt as quickly as what our young people do, essentially.
I'd question the premise that young people adapt faster, because if you grew up with it, where's that? That's not adapting. That's just trying if you're already surrounded by it. I think so. I'm not too sure that young people are adapting. It's the existing people have to adapt.
They get a better fit to that technology than the older people tend to. Or
Sure.
Some older people get there, but for example, learning languages. Most of us would agree that it's a much easier thing to learn when you're younger.
I'm not questioning the ability of young people to learn. It's extraordinary. I'm just questioning the difference between learning something afresh as opposed to adapt to having already learned something and then having to unlearn it and relearn something new, which is not a problem that young people have to suffer as much as older people.
I've got an answer, one answer for you. It's only a little one, but see what you do. Some younger people might want to devote their time once a month to giving a talk on how to use technology, simply, to a bunch of oldies. Now, it's all right for people who are surrounded by technology and right into it to say, oh, it's all easy. And those who grew up, went to school and were introduced to it, have adapted. Of course they have. It's been in their environment every day. But a lot of people are not in either of those positions. And they're very isolated. They'd like to do the basic things. They really don't always have anybody to ask. That's one social thing you could do for older people.
I don't understand the question.
I'd just like to make a quick comment. My aunt died at about 90. But she died at 90 about 3 weeks ago. She had been using the internet right up until she died, emailing everybody left, right and centre. And when she became incapable of sort of getting out and moving about, it was her main means of communication. There was no problem adapting. She saw, this is me getting out there.
And I'm not saying that isn't possible.
It's what people want to do.
It generally doesn't happen as much.
It doesn't, because they've got their way of life and they've got their thing, and they don't see it as being an automatic part of their life or something that they really want necessarily.
What do you guys in the front think?
Of the internet?
Yes, I was just going to make that same point. My background, in terms of my actual job, I've been working professionally with web technology since '94 when I started my company. So I've seen a lot of changes in society in terms of uptake of the internet in particular. And I remember that one of the major socio-economic groups was retirees in terms of rapid uptake of use of the internet. And there was almost this reverse bell curve of young people and older people, and it was the people in the middle who didn't take it up through like the late, sort of the mid-2000s. So that was actually a fairly well researched and reported fact.
I can say in our hackerspace and also in our workspace, we've got both young and old members, and in the hackerspace we've got teenagers through to retirees, and where I work. And what I observe is that the questions and the learning flows both ways in general. There was a recent analysis of Stack Overflow data, which is a programming website where a lot of questions are asked and answered, and what they found was that the younger members of that site asked more questions, and the older members, the greybeards, tend to answer more questions, as a very gross generalisation of the article. So I think it's dangerous to generalise people to people, and it's up to you to learn from others, basically.
I think there are two parts of it as well. I think it's more than just technology. I think it's a confidence thing partly, that young people can sometimes be a lot more optimistic and are more willing to give things a go. But that's a generalisation, so I'll leave that aside. I think the answer to it is to talk to people like Will Donovan, who are experts in user interface design, and come up with user interfaces that can appeal to people who are not used to technology, so that it's more intuitive for them and they get it straight away. I think that's the answer from my perspective.
I think I'm extremely sceptical about the role of the current education system, especially for younger people, in teaching people to develop habits of lifelong learning. I don't think the school system is currently designed to do that. I don't have an answer on how that would be done, but I see a great gap there. It's still the idea that you get imprinted when you're young, and that's supposed to carry you through, and obviously that model doesn't work if people have many different careers and directions through the course of their life.
So on that, what would you suggest in place of that thing? Like, I honestly believe that's the case. Like, why I ask the question is I think that there's too much focus during our working life on working, and we forget about learning altogether. And so we come into what Hugo was talking about earlier, where you get to retirement and it's like, ooh, I can learn stuff again.
I'd like to see more emphasis on teaching critical thinking and problem-solving skills, research, and generally applicable skills that can then be taken forward in life. It's not just learning a set of facts and then the facts are out of date.
Okay, Colin's got a question.
I'm hearing lots of intergenerational hostility. The young versus the oldies. As you can guess, I'm a bit of an oldie. And you might expect, with my age and my background in engineering, that I might have ended up being a grumpy old fart. I am. My daughter entered university in 2004 and has been there ever since, and probably forevermore. And she had her 21st birthday down here. I attended it and went back home and said, send me some photos via email. That was the normal transaction at that time. She would not. She was committed to Facebook. She would only share her photos on Facebook. I resented this a little bit, but I signed up to Facebook and I knew none of the dangers of privacy at the time. I've since learned what to click and what not to click. And so it has gone on, and at one stage during this learning process for me, she sent a letter of complaint, or an email message, a Facebook message, a private message of complaint. Dad, you know more of my friends at uni than I do. And I friended up to them. And so it has been, and it was a young person's interaction. Yes, I'm having a drink, now I'm picking my nose, now I'm going to the toilet. No, but that's their culture, and I couldn't intrude. But I will offer something for the Jerrys like me who are in the audience. Facebook works very well with social connections. It does reach out and to other people, and other people can reach into me. There is a group, a very large group, worldwide group, on Facebook now, which we will call grumpy old farts if you like, or just old guys who are retired, who just want to chew the cud about things. In particular, I'm meeting an extraordinarily broad and highly educated band of physicists, philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, the whole lot. They get on Facebook and they are polite, they are courteous, they are supportive, there are no trolls, there are no spammers. It's a delightful arena to be in, and the young ones are now coming and joining us because they hate the spam and the trolls too.
Set a good example.
I think this is a trend as well in social media networks, that especially with Facebook, people are tired of getting spammed, people are tired of getting ads thrown at them. And so there's a move towards different social networks where you own your own data. A big issue with Facebook is that everything on there is being used to serve you advertisements. And I don't really like that idea. A lot of people don't really like that idea. That might be one of the areas where people are rejecting technology. And there's some social networks where people are moving away from that towards different ones where you own it all. And you also, you choose who you interact with so that you don't have people giving you spam status updates and that kind of thing. And I think that is a trend that I'm excited about. It's not quite here yet, but in the coming years, I think we'll see more of that.
Look, I just have something just quick to add. I've been working on a project with City of Burundara, which is Camberwell, Kew, Hawthorne, blah, blah, blah. It's the highest concentration of secondary school students in the Southern Hemisphere. And they're absolutely screaming about cyberbullying. And I mean, obviously someone who's very pro-technology, I find it really hard. I'm having meetings with all of these principals, and they're advising parents to basically turn computers off and make kids use computers in the lounge room in front of everyone, or and they're really trying to police behaviour online. And I think there is a really, really big problem, an intergenerational problem of understanding what technology is about. I mean, I had to explain to teachers that if you limit young people's access to the internet, you're basically socially isolating them and so forth. Having said that, there have been a lot of issues with, I don't know if you guys are familiar with a website called 4chan. I know I've broken rules 1 and 2 to mention it, but so I'm looking at who's laughing. And I think that there are, we've had a few raids and stuff on school websites. So, I mean, I'm interested in you guys in terms of that collective trolling. Let's call it collective trolling. I mean, I've got my own theories on what it's about. I'm actually very excited by the stuff happening on 4chan. But I mean, if I could throw back to the panel, what do you think about sort of collective trolling and collective raids and all that sort of stuff, and what does that say for the future?
Well, I have a teenage daughter who goes to school in Camberwell, and have yet to experience any of these things that I've heard about and read about, through newspapers. I think that just makes me an unusual and unique parent to have not had a daughter subjected to any of that sort of stuff. But I haven't personally experienced it. What concerns me about our school's attitude is that it is a bit of that we just don't teach any of that stuff. So rather than teaching kids how to interact on sites like Facebook and so on, the kids basically left to their own devices, and I think that's a bother that the school system isn't engaging more.
Does that come down to that double bell curve that you were talking about, that a majority of parents or teachers who are teaching our kids are at that middle level that are not really engaging with technology? Where I know from my perspective, I suppose everybody in this room is kind of in a unique position where if we have kids and they go to school and they do this thing, we're kind of half educated already and have an open eye to what is actually going on. How do we educate that audience group that is not really engaging to actually be more aware? And I relate to some of the government advertising they did about having a conversation with your kids about drugs and alcohol. It's kind of almost like the same thing, making sure that the conversation is open in the home to actually have it and it isn't locked away. Hence the suggestion of, surfing the net in plain view.
Well, I think one of the problematic aspects of technology, and it relates to the intergenerational thing, and should acknowledge that it's not an original thought, that I think it comes from Feinberg, is that things that initially are obviously value-laden in technology, and we have a decision about whether they're a good thing to do or not. So, for example, should we interact with other people through the medium of cyberspace? Should we buy things with credit cards over the internet and so on? The next generation is no longer aware that there were value decisions involved in choosing whether or not to do these things, and they're presented simply as the way things are. And if you look back through the history of technology, decisions about whether we should replace human workers with robots, whether we should outsource all our manufacturing to another country, at some time these were clearly perceived as being value choices. But as people grow up with those value choices, they're simply perceived as facts. That's just the way things are. And I think that's a problematic aspect about the intergenerational use of technology.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the points of an education system, is to ensure that these things aren't just taken as givens. There's that's why we have meant to have the subject of history and so on to explain these things. I think it's just that we have a responsibility as society, parents, educators, governments, to make sure that the members of society, especially the kids, are brought up to have respect and values, and these things apply whether you're in cyberspace or just out somewhere by yourself without adult supervision, no matter what your age. You should just, there's a way to behave and treat other people, irrespective of technology or the internet and so on. And if you get that right, most other things will follow. If you get it wrong, then there's going to be problems.
Okay, so the question was, does rock and roll corrupt young people? I think or was it television, or was it dance, or was it Facebook? Yeah, I think this is a prism through which we see the problem. All the problems of society are currently reflected through this prism. I don't think it changes the problems of society. I think it encourages a little bit of, it makes a good headline, newspaper headline. So I would answer it the same way as I answer the other things. The problems of society, the technology hasn't caused them. It may amplify some of them, but solving the technology problem isn't going to solve that problem of society.
Great. Thanks, guys, very much. So, that was At Home with Technology.